In audit exams, it is really common to see questions asking students to design audit procedures given a set of case information. But the biggest mistake that I see by students at the university level and at the professional qualification level is students who can't differentiate between a test of control and a substantive test. I get students having them mixed up and doing the wrong thing all the time. So in this video, I'm going to help you tease out the differences between the two so that you can ace your audit exam. Let's get into it. Welcome back to all my regular viewers, and if you're new to this channel, my name is Dr. Amanda White and I really do love audit. I have a PhD in behavioural audit, I teach audit at university, and I am a former auditor. So today we're actually going to get into the difference between tests of internal control and substantive tests. Now first off, I want to start talking about what are the differences between the two. Well, a test of control is a test that the control system is operating as it was designed. And when we do our initial control risk assessment, we will assess the design of the internal controls as low, medium, or high risk for the potential for material misstatements. Now, a substantive test uses, a good way to think about it is in the title, substantive. So we're trying to substantiate, in essence, the journal entries and transactions within the accounting. So remember, we've got our accounting data and then we have our internal controls that sit over the top of that. When we're testing internal controls, we're testing the protective layer that opens and closes to allow accounting transactions in if they're valid, or it keeps them out if they don't meet our assertions. So our test of controls is testing this protective layer. Our substantive tests are tests on the accounting data, because the accounting data sits underneath the internal layer, the layer of internal controls. So how does this work in terms of a sequence? And you'll see some drawings, hopefully. I'm trying this out for the very first time, drawing on my iPad, and hopefully that'll appear up here really soon. But if we think about the sequence of tasks, we start by assessing the client under ISA 315, and we use 315 to help us generate our audit risk model. Okay, and if control risk is low or is medium, then that's going to take us down a road of needing to test internal controls. And then once we've tested the internal controls, we're going to reevaluate, I can't spell here, reevaluate our level of detection risk, because remember, detection risk drives how much control and substantive testing we do. And then that will feed into our substantive testing plan. All right, so in terms of the sequence, we'll always test internal controls first and then on to substantive testing, because the results of our control tests will flow forward into our substantive design. Now let's look at an example when it comes to a bank reconciliation. So I'm going to flowchart out the process first. So a bank reconciliation will normally start with, I'm going to do this the paper-based way, 2 documents. You're going to have your cash journal and you're going to have probably downloaded from the internet your bank statement. And you're going to take those two, and this is usually some sort of accountant in the organization will take those two and they're actually going to perform a bank rec. All right, and this is one of the preliminary tasks, easy tasks that we ask auditors to do at the beginning of the audit. So if you've never done one or you're a bit rusty, brush up on one of my other videos on bank reconciliations. So they'll perform a bank reconciliation, and that will actually create a document called the bank rec. All right. Now, what does a bank rec look like? Well, a bank rec, as a little sort of insight here, is a document. It'll contain all of the items that are being reconciled, and then hopefully those two reconciling numbers will actually match. Now, that bank reconciliation is normally performed by one particular person. They create the bank reconciliation. So I'm just going to give this a little title here, bank rec. But what needs to happen is that the bank reconciliation needs to be checked to make sure that the accountant did it correctly. So I'm going to draw a line here as a division of responsibility, and typically you'll have someone like the financial controller will come along and will review the bank reconciliation. So they will actually have a process of reviewing the bank rec. Okay, so they'll actually look at that document, and at the end of that process, what will happen is that they will generate a signed or reviewed or approved bank reconciliation. Okay, now what that means in practice is that the financial controller will go and they will check everything over, and then they will put their little signature there as a process of approval. So when I'm looking at this piece of documentation, I'm thinking, well, what exactly is the internal control? Now, the internal control is actually going to be, there's two parts to this. Number one, a bank rec gets created, and number two is that a bank rec gets approved. So for us, part of the process is the creation of the bank rec, but the internal control is that signature. It's the approval process. So if I'm testing here, what sort of test would I be doing? If I'm testing internal controls, my job is going to be to test that the signature exists, that the approval process, the control, has been executed. And I'll do that for a sample of bank reconciliations, for a sample of different accounts, depending on the number of accounts, of course, that the client has. So that's the test of the internal control. If I said test the internal control of a bank reconciliations, I'd be looking to make sure that that control in this particular client has been approved, checked off, and signed. So I want to make sure the signature is by the financial controller or their delegated person that can do that particular job. Now, what if I was doing this substantively? If I said, okay, there's a bank reconciliation process, test that substantively. Well, what I would be doing is I would be reperforming the bank reconciliation. I'd be looking line by line through the bank reconciliation and back through the cash journal and back through the bank statement to make sure that that process was actually done correctly. So if you go to ISA 500 for audit evidence, reperformance is one of the things that's recommended in the explanatory material. So I'd be going back and I'd be reperforming line by line the bank reconciliation as a substantive test to make sure that all of those individual transactions are recorded appropriately. So that's the difference between the two. The difference is that the control is usually somebody checking, approving something, and we have to inspect a document or look online to make sure that check or control actually occurred. Whereas the substantive test usually involves checking detailed individual transactions to original source documents. Now, you might think, great, I understand that. I'm going to make this slightly more complicated with the idea of a dual purpose test. Now, you might be going, Amanda, dual purpose test? Oh no, what's this? So, I'm going to start a new slide. So when it comes to dual purpose tests, I'm going to use the example of a modern point of sale or invoice system. All right. So you will go to a company and you order something. You're going to have an invoice. That invoice will have the item that you've ordered, it'll have the price, it'll have the quantity, and then it'll have the total. Okay, so you have item number 1, it's $5, you've got 2 of a quantity, so the total should be 10. Okay, item number 2, they are $10 each. Whoops, not $10 there. You've got 10 of those, that will be 100. And then the system automatically gives you a total of $110. I'm not including goods and services tax or anything like that here. Now, in modern computer systems, this price will come from some sort of computer database that contains prices. All right, so the price will automatically feed in, and the total will come from the price multiplied by the quantity to give you the total. Now, if that's happening in a computer system, that price times quantity and the process of the price coming from the price list is actually an internal control. It's part of the system designed to make sure that we give customers the correct receipts or the correct invoices. So here, if I'm doing a test, if I'm testing the control, I want to make sure that when I input an item, it calls the correct price from the price database. Now, you might think, okay, that's great. The system also takes price and it multiplies it by quantity to give you the total. So if I took the price from the database, multiplied it by the quantity in the system, and calculated the total, I'm also testing that that calculation total control is working. So there I've tested the control, but imagine I was substantively testing this. Imagine I take my journal entry and what I'm doing is I'm vouching back to the invoice, and when I get to the invoice, I'm going to use the process of recalculation. Now, recalculation is you take the price, you take the quantity, you multiply them, and you get the total. So here I've used the same test to test a control and to test substantively. And in that particular instance, those are called our dual purpose tests. We're seeing more and more dual purpose tests, of course, in computerized accounting systems because a lot of the things we did manually are now part of a control. Now, you wouldn't do these at two separate times. So you wouldn't test it as a control and then later test it substantively. You'd just do one big sample and test it all at the beginning when you're testing the internal control, but you'd call it a dual purpose test. And if this was sales, that would also allow me to tick off the assertion of accuracy when it comes to recording sales revenue. Now, hopefully this has cleared up any confusion you might have between tests of control and substantive tests. Obviously, there are still different types for each of those. You can check out plenty of my other videos for examples, worked examples of tests of internal controls. But of course, if you're new to the channel and you haven't already, click the subscribe button. If you thought the video was useful, I'd really appreciate a like. If you have any questions, drop them in the comments. And as always, you can find me on social media on Instagram and on Facebook at Amanda Loves to Audit, on Twitter at Amanda's Audit, and I'm always hanging out here on YouTube. So thanks very much, and I'll see you next time. Bye.